I learned something. Something Curtis said, that maybe the myth is so interesting to Heidegger because at least it connects care and time, and he's really got nothing to go on to connect care and temporality. He's got a story about care that he can relate to his three aspects of being in, but what he would like to do is get you to start to see that the structure of care is the structure of temporality. But I don't have more to say about it, and I don't want to fall back into it. I want to go on. So now Heidegger is going to take up, remember, and in a way, as I say, Division 1 ends with care, because that's the meaning of being. That's the meaning of Dasein. That's the terms in terms of which you can understand why Dasein has the structure it has, the threefold unified structure. Or at least you can begin to understand it, or at least you can name it. But whatever that is, now there's two other very interesting, important sort of appendices, or really, that sort of interrupt the argument, the flow of the argument, because really he would be going on from care directly to Division 2 and temporality as the meaning of care. That is, that in terms of which you can make sense of care. But he doesn't, because he has important things to say about reality. And there are two different issues about reality that he thinks, rightly, that his phenomenology of Dasein enables him to make big steps forward concerning. One of them, I think he just totally wipes out epistemology and the problem of the existence of the external world as a kind of, well, it's not quite a joke, but as a very, very total mistake. And then he gets involved in this interesting, complicated question about realism, idealism, anti-realism. What is the status of the entities that we deal with, the ready-to-hand and the present-at-hand? So we got to do both those things. Obviously, we're not going to do both today. I'm going to do, for sure, this question about the reality of the external world, and I hope begin the question about that's a mind issue, the external world, I mean, the inner, outer. And then there's just the status of those entities out there in the universe. That's what we're going to do next time. Then we're still going to be one lecture behind, which isn't bad. So let's do it. Well, where are we? Heidegger's got the story now. The Dasein, the structure of the way of disclosedness is the Dasein as taking a stand on it. Dasein takes a stand on its being, and that enables Dasein to disclose the world and discover entities, both ready-to-hand entities and present-at-hand entities. That's not supposed to be news. That's just supposed to be where we are. And now he's going to draw conclusions about issues concerning reality. And now there's so much that's just sort of said the way, as he says it, is as good as I could say it, that I'm going to be reading a lot for a minute from where we are in the book. Where we are in the book is on 244, German 200, and which is the section on Dasein, worldhood, and reality. And I want to start reading things the middle of 245. I'm in the middle of a sentence in the middle of the page. The interpretation of being takes its orientation from the being of entities within the world. That's how it's always been. Thereby the being of what is it, primarily available, that is, what is approximately ready to hand, gets passed over, and entities are first conceived in the context of things, race, which are occurrent, which are present at hand. So he's just telling you traditional ontology only has one understanding of being, namely that beings are what he calls present at hand. He goes on, being acquires the meaning of reality, and now he says just what I've been saying, substantiality becomes the basic characteristic of being. So that goes from back to Aristotle and behind Aristotle, so back to Descartes and behind Descartes to Aristotle. And now I want to see if I want to read more. Yes, I want to go on. Corresponding to this way in which the understanding of being has been diverted, namely leaving out the special kind of being of Dasein, leaving out the special kind of being of equipment, just focusing on the present at hand. Even the ontological understanding of Dasein moves in the horizon of this conception of being. Like any other entity, Dasein too is present at hand as real. And that is, it's a thinking thing. And now skipping way down to this last paragraph, second sentence. We must demonstrate that reality, that is, what, as understood by the tradition, namely as substances which are self-sufficient, is only one kind of being among others that are ontologically others, but that ontologically it has a definite connection in its foundations with Dasein, the world, and readiness to hand. So we're trying to figure out, understand now how to relate this reality as substance story to all the phenomenology that Heidegger's been giving you. And then he gives you what he's going to talk about at the bottom of 245. Under the heading, the problem of reality, various questions are clustered. Whether, now I've tried to sort of retranslate this so that it makes a little more sense. It's hard because in German, the Das Seiende could mean an entity, but it could mean the totality of entities. Then I'm trying to make it mean what it needs to make sense at the bottom here. So I want to say, one, see where we are at the bottom of 245, 201 bottom in German. Whether the beings which supposedly transcend our consciousness, that's this totality of entities, the beings which supposedly, beings, plural, stuff, things, which supposedly transcend our consciousness are at all, that is, the questions about idealism, whether this reality of the external world can be adequately proved, that's the first thing we're going to talk about in a minute, that's the epistemology. How far, now you have to say, this totality of beings, if it is real, is to be known in its being in itself. Can you know nature? Can you know the universe of beings as they are in themselves? That's the ontological question we're going to get to next time. What the meaning of this totality of beings, namely reality, signifies in general. I'm not sure what that doesn't mean anything to me. Once he's done the epistemological question, which is the external world issue, and once he's done the realism-idealism question, that's the ontological issue, I don't see what that last question is, what the meaning of this entity, namely the totality of beings, namely what traditionally has been called reality, signifies in general. Keep your eye open for that. Maybe we'll see what it means. I never really paid attention till this minute. But you can see that he's got it fixed later. Here are the real issues, right following. A, reality is a problem of being, and that means whether the external world can be proved, that is, answer to skepticism about whether there's an external world and how we know it. Then, B, reality is an ontological problem. That's whether there is any independent reality. And reality is care, is just his way of taking it back into his way of describing things. Maybe that's what the last move is. But I'm interested in those first two moves. So we're going to do now epistemology. What epistemology means. How many have had the epistemology course we give? Okay, well, you've heard about epistemology. How many have heard about epistemology in 25B? Descartes and so forth. Well, good. That's where you should have heard about it. That's why it's important to have that course. It means it's the theory of knowledge in English, epistemology. It's just fancier talk to call it epistemology. And the theory, it's about knowing. It's about how we can know that there's an external world. And it's about skepticism, because people, after Descartes, realized that if Descartes' right, and there's a self-contained substance called the mind, and in it's all these experiences, they got a big problem as to how anybody would ever know whether there was anything out there outside the mind that these experiences corresponded to. And they worried about it. Heidegger says lots of the philosophers tried to prove that they could know the external world, and Heidegger thinks that's just a big mistake. That is, you have to, when you do the phenomenology, you'll discover that this whole problem of how the inner gets to know the outer, that is the external world, is a non-problem. It took a long time for Descartes to con people into it, and now it looks just natural. Now, how many of you were at Dredski's talk yesterday? Any of you? Did you notice how he began? I thought you would. Yes, you would. He started by saying that what he's going to talk about is the kind of experience that's in our head, and that there's a disagreement about how detailed the experience or the representation of the world in our head is, and he devoted his whole talk to an argument about that, never questioning somehow what in the world it would mean to say that all this experience was literally, he said, in our head. That's how much this, and Dredski's a good philosopher and has written important things on intentionality and action. He's retired now from Stanford. I say partly this because he's also going to talk this afternoon from 4 to 6 in Moses Library, with the way the library gets taken away from you, which is okay, because in there's going to be a lecture on what skepticism and self-knowledge, right? I suppose that's related to this. I suppose that's going to be also about how you know what's in your head, and how much of what well, never mind. I won't try to guess. I'm going to go. I suggest if you want to see a kind of very nice and very intelligent example, sort of fossil example of what Heidegger and Wittgenstein have, extinct species that Heidegger and Wittgenstein have sort of put out of their misery, you will then want to see this. That reminds me of something Richard Rorty, who was always campaigning against epistemology, has this wonderful metaphor about when will this news that the epistemology, there is no problem, will reach his colleagues who are floundering around in the collapsing circus tent of Cartesianism. So anyway, you will all, after this course, be out of it and won't have those kind of problems anymore, if you ever even had them. Okay, and now we need some important distinctions. So he wants to distinguish between the world, which is disclosed by Dasein, and the entities that are discovered in the world. I think way back I told you that that was actually an important distinction to pay attention to, but there hasn't been any real important reason up to now why it mattered whether we paid attention to it. Now it turns out that those are two separate questions. He wants to both deal with the question whether we know the world at all, whether there's anything disclosed outside of our experience, and then he wants to know how we know about the particular things, what we know and how we know it, about the things in the world. Those are both questions for epistemology. By the way, one more remark, which strikes me as important, it won't strike you as important, where all this history of, you could write a history of recent philosophy as sort of what happened to epistemology, because it was once the required course. When I was a graduate student, and the best professor in the department, C.I. Lewis, taught it, and everybody took it seriously, and the only question anybody ever asked about anything was, how do we know that domain of objects, and so forth. And then I think it certainly wasn't the influence of Heidegger. I presume it was the influence of Wittgenstein mainly. Epistemology just sort of faded out. It's not a requirement anymore, as you all know. It's one possible, it isn't, is it? I'm not going to contradict myself. It's one possible upper division philosophy course you can take, but it's lost its position as the thing you have to know first and best before you can do philosophy. And that's just another way of saying these arguments that we're going to hear, and parallel arguments in Wittgenstein, which I'll mention later, have really gotten rid of it. Okay, now we're going to talk about it. So Heidegger thinks that when you understand our way of being in the world, there's no way you can doubt the existence of the world, and or either one, or the things in, and you can't doubt the things in the world either. And that's, of course, because we're being in the world, and moreover, and that's because we need entities in order to cope with entities, in order to take a stand on our being. So Dasein's got to have a world. I mean, what the final status of it is going to come up next time, whether maybe it's all some kind of big illusion. But whatever it is, we've got to have the experience of disclosing a world and of coping with the entities in it. If that's just the kind of being we are. So in 247, he says, at the bottom of 246 it starts. The question of whether there is a world at all and whether its being can be proved makes no sense if it's raised by Dasein as being in the world, and who else would raise it? That's the point I'm making now. I just want to read you the other places where he says similar things. This question of having a proof that Kant mentions of Dasein, of the Dasein of things outside us. That's again, whenever you see the external world or the world outside us, or how the inner gets out directed toward the outer and all that, that's all the same issue that he keeps wanting to say doesn't make any sense. Let's see. I have something marked as something I want to read, but now I'm not sure I want to read it. Let's read it just to find out. At the top of 247, back to that. Furthermore, it is encumbered with a double signification, this business about Dasein being in the world. The world is the wherein of being in. Yeah, that's right. I just want to repeat this. I said it already, but I didn't read anything. The world is the wherein of being in. That's the disclosed thing. And the world is entities within the world. That's what you discover. And notice he's got the first world is not in quotes. That's it. That's the space of everything, the openness to everything. And then there is also the world in quotes. Remember what the world in quotes means, back from that page where he defines world, the totality of entities. And that is so both the disclosive space and the totality of entities, and that's when you're concernfully absorbed with the entities, they've either been confused or are not distinguished, but the world is disclosed essentially along with the being of Dasein, and with the disclosedness of the world in quotes has in each case been discovered, you'll notice, too. He's being very clear and careful about disclosed and discovered, and about quotes and unquotes. He set all that up way back so he could say these things clearly. And now, one more quote that I think is important. I don't see it. 245. Oh, 245. Okay, let's look at, yes, the bottom of 245. I jumped ahead and read it already, so that's why I don't need it. So then he's going to give a new account of the traditional problems, he says on 246, which again, I'm just showing you that he's saying the things that I say he says, because it's important to see it in the text. The middle of 246. It has long been held that the way to grasp the real is by the kind of knowing which is characterized by this beholding. That's just a point which he makes every once in a while, that you can know things by equipment, and in fact that's more basic to know something as by using a hammer than by just looking at it. Such knowing is as a way in which the soul or consciousness behaves. See, this is the wrong way of thinking about it. Insofar as reality has the character of something independent and in itself, the question of the meaning of reality comes linked with that of whether the real can be independent of consciousness, or whether there can be a transcendence of consciousness into the sphere of the real. That's all epistemological. Well, it's both. Whether there is such a thing is the ontological question. Whether we could know it by getting outside our minds is the epistemological. And I would say on 252, he says it again. Yeah, there, I'm just jumping. See, that was the beginning of this whole section. Now I'm jumping to the end of the section about the skepticism of the external world, because that's where he actually makes this epistemology-ontology distinction, which is very important to keep in mind. So he says, right before B, right at 209 in the margin, on 252, our discussion of the unexpressed presuppositions of attempts to solve the problem of reality in ways that are just epistemological shows that this problem must be taken back as an ontological one into the existential analytic of Dasein. Ooh, that's not so helpful as I thought it would be. It's true that there are two meanings of ontological. There's the ontological question about idealism and realism, and then there's Heidegger's claim that he's doing ontology, that is, he's describing the being of Dasein. I think you would just better not listen to what I said for 5 minutes. It's not wrong, it's just not making the point that I wanted to make. But you don't need Heidegger to tell you that you can distinguish epistemology from ontology in the traditional version of each, and that's all I've been saying. So now we're going to turn to epistemology. And so Heidegger takes up the question whether there is an external world and whether we could prove that there's an external world, given that all we've got access to is our own internal experience. And so now he's going to talk about first the world as the the disclosure space in general, and then he's going to talk about the things in the world. So first we do the first one, and we've already read. There's no way that Dasein can doubt the existence of the world in the sense of this openness to stuff that is so fundamental to what we are. And I don't have to read that again, and probably not the other one either. But just to sum up what he says, let's look at the middle of 249. He's going to tell you Dasein is openness to the world. Dasein is, he'll say later, remember, I keep saying, its world existingly. We are open heads turned toward the world, to talk like Merleau-Ponty. And at the middle of 249, he says, if Dasein is understood correctly, it defies such proofs. That is, need proofs that there is a world outside of our private experience. Because in its being, it already is outside. That is what subsequent proofs demand and deem are necessary to demonstrate it. Dasein is already outside it. It is, there's one funny place in Division 2 where he says it is the outside itself in and for itself, which is a mouthful, but that's just a very condensed version. That's what it is, basically, the outside itself. So you can't worry about how it got outside itself. And so all the philosophical moves are hopeless. But at the top of 250, he talks about them, and it's interesting because you'll come across them in other courses, probably less and less as people get out of the circus tent of epistemology altogether. But at the top of 250, to have faith in the reality of the external world, that was what I learned as a graduate student, was animal faith in the external world. There's a philosopher named Santayana, who is probably rightfully forgotten, was all interested in that one. To prove the reality of the external world, lots of people were trying, whether adequately or inadequately, all of them inadequately, Heidegger thinks. To presuppose it, that's another interesting move. That's really Searle's move. Searle talks about how we just take for granted the external world in all of our everyday behavior. He has the example that when you apply for a grant to study electrons, say, you don't have to include in the introduction to the grant that there are electrons out there independent of your experience. You just can take that for granted. Everybody can take for granted. And that's the sense in which you simply presuppose it, whether explicitly or not. Yep, some people think you explicitly presuppose it. Searle thinks you implicitly presuppose it. the attempts such as these have not mastered in their own basis with full which have not mastered in their own basis with full transparency, presuppose a subject proximately worldless or unsure of its world, which must at bottom first assure itself of a world. Anybody read Cavell? Cavell is one of the last, I think, of the philosophers who are very much concerned about this. He thinks we have to acknowledge the external world and that that's some big, better move. But that's just another move, sort of there is us and there is the world, and then there is some relation between us. Cavell gave this paper at an APA meeting, an American Philosophical Association meeting, thinking that he really made a big step forward with acknowledging the external world or the world. And Stroud commented on it and pointed out that it's just one more of a long line of hopeless versions of the relation between us and the world. And Cavell got very upset. The meeting turned very nasty. It may have been the end of this particular paragraph. So all of those aren't going to work, and Heidegger knows that. And so we go on. So, and as he puts it, sort of all the proofs come too late. There are so many different ways of saying this. The next paragraph, the problem of reality in the sense of the question whether an external world is present at hand and whether such a world can be proved turns out to be an impossible one. Not because its consequences lead to inextricable impasses, because the very entity which serves as its theme is one which repudiates any formulation of the question. That's pretty clear and strong, and I've just been saying that in various forms. And I have here that there's a place where we talk about the inner. I was going to just mention that because we haven't really yet. No? Okay, that's fine. So it looks like you can't even state the skeptical question meaningfully, according to Heidegger. And that is what I think we are supposed to, that's the right thing to conclude. It just doesn't make any sense. How can you ask whether there is any external world or whether we know the external world or how do we know the external world when the internal-external distinction doesn't get a grip on anything in the phenomenal world that you have to start from. And that he's just saying that on 250. Now, I'm just repeating myself here. So now there's only one more question that needs to be taken up in this respect, and this is a funny one. Well, why do people believe this? And for all this time, I think not 2,000 years, because I don't think Aristotle had, for instance, the notion that all of his experience was inner. I'm not sure. If anybody knows Aristotle better, you can tell me. I think the inner thing starts with Descartes, but at least since Descartes, which is already 300 years, so 1638 is the Meditations. 400 years. People have been under the influence of this. And Heidegger has a very weak answer. I don't know if any of you will have a better answer. You're welcome to write a paper if you want. I'll tell you his answer and my answer, and I'll tell you that it's an interesting question to try to motivate all these smart philosophers, really smart philosophers, like Kant, Spinoza, and Leibniz, and Descartes, believing there was this inner-outer problem. Heidegger thinks it's a form of falling, he says at the middle of 250. That we have a tendency to bury the external world in nullity epistemologically before going on to prove it. The reason for this lies in Dasein's falling, in the way in which the primary understanding of being has been diverted to being as presence at hand, a diversion which is motivated by the falling itself. Boy, I don't know what that means. If anybody does and wants to defend it or criticize it, I think it would be interesting. I was just wondering about it yesterday and today. Whichever meaning of falling you've got, this doesn't seem to fit it. It certainly can't be because people fall into their work, that is, they fall to work, they get absorbed in their flow, that they come and think that all there is present-at-hand beings outside of our present-at-hand mind. Is it, well, then it's because they're hiding from themselves, their ungroundedness? That seems a strange reason to be caught in this kind of epistemology. Well, I'll give you what I think is a slightly better answer, but I doubt if I could defend it very long. I think that it's because, where am I? Oh yeah, it's because when you stop to think and do philosophy and reflect, then you get a distinction between the mind and the world. The level at which John Searle talks about things, where there is the mind toward world direction of fit and the world toward mind direction of fit, and you're trying to do something, and it hasn't happened yet, but you're trying to make the world come out a certain way, or the world is impinging on you in perception, and it's causing experiences in your mind. All of this is a natural way, I think, or pretty close to a natural way to think about things when there's some kind of breakdown. It's not a natural way to think about things when you're coping in the world, and I'm not even sure it's very natural then. I'm not very satisfied with this. But at least when there's a breakdown and you've got to sort of confront the world, you do then sort of stand back and you see something like you've got these goals and you can't achieve them, but the goals are somehow in your mind, but your ability to achieve them depends on the stuff out there in the world. And somehow, taking off from that, Descartes, that worked all this out, he said he had to go into a warm room for the winter, totally free of passions of any sort, and reflect, and out of that, comes the meditations in which he doubts the existence of his own body and all kinds of very weird things. And I think it's that attitude of withdrawing from the world and reflecting, either because your workshop is broken down or because you're a philosopher like Descartes, that maybe gives you this wrong answer. But I think it's a deep and interesting question. Why do we believe this? Yeah.
Mind and the body, and reflection on the relationship of human beings, whether they're...
Well, that may be I don't see it. I mean, that's sort of part of the problem, naturally, when Descartes did withdraw, and if the stuff is inner, and it's in your head, as Gretzky said, then, or in your mind, as Searle would say, then the body just drops out of the story as another object. I think, and that's part of the problem. But I don't want to spend time on it. I just think that Heidegger is right to try to take it on, but hasn't done a good job of telling you the answer. Okay, now, we still have another piece of it. It's sort of done from the start, whether Dasein is separate from the world, because we did it by the definition that it's the being that takes a stand on its being by using beings to, and so forth. But we haven't done the other half of it, which is exactly what I just said. What about the totality of entities? Besides this disclosive space, are there entities out there that we discover? How do we ever know that we've discovered any of them? Or do we just, are we always sort of in doubt and never able to be certain of anything out there? This is what he's switching to on 251, where he says at the top, along with Dasein as being in the world, entities within the world have in each case already been disclosed. That's what we're talking about now. This existential ontological assertion seems to accord with the thesis of realism that the external world is really present at hand. But that's what it seems to, but that's not what he thinks. We'll get back to realism. I want to just talk about the idea about the way things in the world. I think that he's got a view, or he should have a view, that Charles Taylor, who is a very good phenomenologist and a fan of Merleau-Ponty particularly, has this idea that you can't cope with things coping with things is not like having a belief about them. If you believe that there's a moon, then your belief can correspond to the moon or not correspond to the moon, and you may never be sure that you've got enough evidence to be sure to know that there's a moon. I mean, you can do it all if you think that the problem is sort of how your beliefs relate to things in the world. But if you're coping with things in the world, and then Charles Taylor says things like, well, you can't kick a football and unless there's a football. And that's different. You can believe that there's a Santa Claus even if there isn't a Santa Claus, and believe there is a moon or not. But your skillful engagement with things requires that there be the things that you're engaged with. You can't separate off your football kicking skills from actually kicking. I think I can think of better examples than his, so I'm going to give you two. The examples which I think show that you couldn't exercise the skills that you've got if there weren't the entities on which you're exercising them. And it may be more about my psychology. People have told me that what I'm saying is just perhaps some people's phenomenology. I think, for instance, that you can't have the skill for tying your shoelaces, except if you've got your hands on your shoelaces. You can't describe, or you can't even go through the motions, try it, of tying your shoelaces without the laces. I think that's the real intuition that Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty ought to have. Or consider the famous example, do you know which finger you type the letter E on your typewriter? Now, maybe people differ. I'd have no idea unless I try to imagine myself in front of the keyboard. Even that doesn't work. That may be something wrong with me. But only if I'm in front of the keyboard do I know which finger I type the E with by typing something like the T-H-E, and seeing what my finger does. I mean, the moral of that's supposed to be, you can't have the skills for taking a stand on your being by coping with things, except insofar as there are these things to cope with. You can't put the skill separate from the things in your mind and then ask the question about whether there are actually any things out there. There have to be keyboards and shoelaces, footballs out there if you're going to have skills for coping. Anyway, that's a line. Again, maybe a possible paper topic. Okay, I've gotten to a stopping point and nobody said anything. If you feel like, if you've been repressing saying anything, you should, because I finished, that's the epistemology part. I've argued that there's got to be an external world, both because you are being in the world, namely openness to a world, that you've got no inner, and I've argued there have to be things in that world because you can't cope with, you can't take a stand on your being except in coping with things, and you can't cope with things if there aren't things to cope with. That's the argument so far. Yeah. That's right. For a little, you aren't Dasein yet. I think that's.
Epistemology, or can try, and as unsuccessful as it may be, in trying to solve this mystery of how we become that.
No, I think that's an important and interesting mystery, and it's funny that you should mention. I was going to come around to it in the ontology part, but I don't think that traditional philosophy has a sense of what that mystery is. So, and I don't think that epistemology can deal with it, or ontology. I don't think anybody can deal with it, but keep the mystery under your hat for a while. Yeah.
You've given the example of like there could be a complete amount of some cultures.
Yeah, people get annoyed at me for thinking that, but I do. Yeah.
Maybe Heidegger was talking about quality as a reason for this. That maybe it's a cultural phenomenon of sort of modern thought that we start with the inner.
Well, you see, you're stating the question and not answering it. The question then becomes, and why did modern thought get into this peculiar thing? Which it's true, I grant you, and that's important. I think that this issue wouldn't even make sense to the people in Bali, for instance. And that's just another way of saying it's very peculiar that our culture's got itself in this frame of mind of thinking there's an inner and an outer. And now the question is, what about people enabled Descartes to come up with this and con them into it? That's still the question. I don't know whether that's a deep, important, interesting question or just a crazy question, but since Heidegger asks it and answers it so badly, it seems to me it's a challenge to think about. Yeah. Dave? Okay, you.
Part of calling it that you experience the world in terms of it's already been given a meaning within language.
Okay.
And so the way that we most related things only in terms of like they're being named different way. So in that sense we're promoted towards thinking about things as substantive, that's not material.
Okay, but why are we thinking? Well, okay, that's half the answer, but it's the wrong half, I think, because you told us, well, it's not a bad half, but I mean, one wants to know why we think that reality is substances. This is sort of a question for Aristotle, and your answer is probably okay. I mean, it's in our grammar, Nietzsche would say, and that's what you're saying too. But my question right now, Heidegger's question right now, isn't why do we think of the stuff out there as substances? But why do we think that there's something in our head, which is our experience, which has to get outside of our head and relate to those substances that are out there? Why can't we just be open heads turned toward the world, which I think we probably were for Aristotle, as far as I can tell. I mean, that seems to, well, how did we get talked out of the idea that we can experience substances directly and get the idea that we have in our minds a representation of the world, which has to be connected up with the world, and you end up a skeptic once you start thinking that way. I didn't mention skepticism in that way, but I mean, even Searle thinks that skepticism is a valid position. It's just that we don't need to worry about it because we can just assume that there's a world and we all share this assumption. But it follows, if you think that the mind is the self-sufficient center of intentionality and the world are these substances out there, then you've got the problem of the external world and you've got skepticism, because then the question is, well, how in the world do you know that there's any world out there? All you've got access to is the experiences in here. Well, before you know, somebody else who hadn't said something. Yeah. Yes, you're right. That Descartes gets there by trying to convince you that all the stuff that you thought you were directly experienced, you can doubt. And finally, even up to the point where it could all be a dream. But what you can't doubt is what you've definitely got in your head, in your mind, and that's the dream. And then he discovers that there's no reason to believe anything else is out there more really than dreams, and dreams aren't out there. There's all that moves being made by way of demanding certainty. And it's true that we don't have certainty about anything particular in the world except through this kind of skill certainty, which I think is interesting. But again, you're not answering my question is, why did people let themselves be convinced that just because sometimes we dream, that we could never have any direct access to the world, but only access to our private experiences? I mean, that's a big jump, and it's an interesting jump, and people are still sort of debating it, the argument from illusion and so forth, where it looks like sometimes there is something in our mind which doesn't correspond to, we have experience sometimes which don't correspond to anything. Now, if you once say, and you mean in our mind doesn't correspond to anything out there, you're on the way to this. But the question is, how do you let that talk you out of the Heidegger view that we are the world existingly? Okay, I don't want to spend too long on this, but I'm glad to let people tell me what they think. Yeah. He doesn't have to expand it. I mean, it isn't as if Heidegger wants to expand the notion of the external world, for instance, or reality to stuff being out there. He's asking, if you start with the phenomenon, you get this openness to the world. And no sense when we're most engaged that there's anything going on in here at all. I'll have to say something about that in a minute. Going on in here is funny. But anyway, so Heidegger's trying to ask how we ever shrank our rich relation to reality to this minimal, all we've got is a representation in our heads. Let me say a word about that, because it's often, and it happens to me too, you can begin to believe the in your head story if you think about that it's your brain that's in your head, and something has definitely got to go on in your brain, which is in your head, for you to be able to see the chairs and the people out there. And I suspect lots of you really think that that's why this issue still makes sense and epistemology still makes sense. But notice that somebody like Dredske is not saying it's in his brain. He's saying, and this is so ambiguous, in his head. What he really means is in his mind, because whatever's going on in the brain is a physical sort of thing, and all kinds of neurons are sending messages back and forth, and nobody understands how it works. But whatever it is, it's not a story about our experience. And this whole issue is about our experience. How does our experience of objects guarantee that there are any objects? How does our experience of the world? So when somebody like Dredske says it's in his head, he's not talking about the brain. That's not what anybody in the epistemology business or the ontology business is talking about. Because nobody, let me repeat it, doubts that there's a brain in your head and that there's stuff going on which in some loose sense at least corresponds to you're having an experience of people and chairs. But it won't be an answer to the epistemological question if somebody starts telling you sort of which neurons are firing when you're seeing this or that thing in the external world. It's the external world is external to your mind, not your brain, and the internal world is your private experiences, not the firing, which may have some interesting relation to the firing of neurons, but that's not what the question is about. Now, Tyler.
Economic or thing we play with Mars. I don't think something very interesting happened with the flavor. We went from hoping for the books and the organized voting.
Well, no, Heidegger doesn't think about it because you just have to you still could raise the question about the other people. I mean, it does, how do we know that there are other people if all we really know is that there's the experiences of other people in our mind? This is a much more fundamental question. It may be that you could make a case, probably somebody has, that it became easier to believe this Descartes story when certain economic things happened. I don't know. But once you see it, it's a philosophical question, and telling you that it's caused by the brain or caused by the economic conditions is just irrelevant to the philosophical question that comes up as soon as you think the internal and the external. And I don't see how you can. One last thing, and then I want to go back to this. Yeah.
Well, I want to bring it too much back to the brain, but we're focusing here with.
Yes. Yes.
Or using it. That are both released and there are that are released. So, but if you can say the metaphor term to kind of work, metaphor do.
Whoa, we went too fast. Metaphors have a neurological basis in the mind. What is that? Well, what could that do? How could that help? I mean, sure that when you have a metaphor, there are certain neurons firing. So what? Yeah.
Then our human experiences are organized in our brain according to that.
Well, I don't believe it. Wait a minute. I don't think so. I mean, if Heidegger's phenomenology is right, even if I believe the metaphor that it's all going on in my brain or in my mind as a container, that doesn't help get rid of, well, there is still the phenomenon, namely that I'm seeing things out there that the idea of the inner doesn't get a grip on my experience, Heidegger wants to say. If you just describe the phenomenon. Now, it may be that this metaphor has a lot of grip on people since Descartes, but it hasn't changed their experience, I think. I mean, I don't think that Descartes, when he was out in the world, was experiencing tables and chairs and people any more than anybody else as inner. But he's got a proof based on whoever said this thing about you can't be certain of anything. Now, okay, you are definitely the last. I have to go on, but go ahead.
I'm troubled by the counterexample that
Okay.
Even if we don't take like dreams or like illusions or misperceptions as a stepping stone into a strict subject-object delineation or mind matter split or representation of reality and so forth, it still seems like it could be problematic. For example, that we might exist.
Like the Matrix, maybe.
Like that, yeah. Like, you know, that the objects, as I perceive them, don't exist anything like I think they do. And that even if I develop these skills, I'm not actually interacting with them in anything like close to how they are. My temptation is to say that it's just not really relevant, or it's not problematic.
It probably is, but it is for me today. But it's important. I mean, somebody could write a question about Heidegger's view of the matrix, because the interesting question is whether, regardless of the fact that that there is a brain in a vat, there's also that brain isn't having inner experiences. There's a shared world of people that interact and hurt each other and have causal relations and so forth. And the question is something like, but you were on the right track. Could you have a world in which there was being with and coping with things and taking a stand on your own being, while some computer was really manipulating your brain and you were really in a vat? I think Heidegger ought to say that the answer is yes, and that he's describing that world, and that the people who have epistemological issues about skepticism, and this is where you said that that story isn't even relevant, because the issue is going to come up again for what's his name, Neo, when he sees a desk. Is he having a private experience of the desk, or is he sort of just an open mind? And the answer is, well, his brain is doing something. It's the causal basis of his seeing the desk, but so is my brain doing something. It's the causal basis of my seeing you. You can still raise the epistemological question inside the matrix, I think. But anyway, that's a great subject for a paper. But you got to do it in terms of Heidegger. Don't just tell me about the movie. Okay. Now, I got to go on, or I'm going to be 2 days behind. And the other one is so interesting and complicated. But I did want to, no, I'm not quite done, just because I wanted to read some interesting quotes. There's this fascinating quote that I can't resist reading, where Heidegger is remember, you could say one thing, that we have beliefs about the external world, and that those beliefs might or might not be true, like we have beliefs about Santa Claus and the moon and so forth. And Wittgenstein and Heidegger both think that it isn't a question of beliefs about the external world. Our relation to the external world isn't a relation between inner and external, and it isn't an external world. We have practices which engage us with things and people. Once you start thinking that our relation to things and people is that we have beliefs in our mind about them, and you start asking whether the beliefs in our mind are justified or true, you're lost already. And Heidegger says in his lecture in the History of the Concept of Time on 215, nothing in our relationship to the world provides a basis for the phenomenon of belief in the world. I have not yet been able to find this phenomenon of belief. And I think Wittgenstein says something very similar to that on his book on certainty. So you've got to make this move. So the two things that get in your way when you think about this and can push you in the direction of Descartes is bringing in issues about the brain and the matrix and so forth. And the other one is just automatically starting to think about all this, about whether our beliefs about the world and about objects in the world are justified or not. It's part of the basic move not to talk about beliefs. No, I'm sorry we can't because I got to go on. I shouldn't have even done that. Okay, we're going to make a transition to the ontological question. And that's the question of, really the question, I just started to tell you so you won't lose track in all, because it's very complicated. It's subtle and interesting. The simple question to blur it out is there a universe of stuff out there? Well, out there now, not outside the mind, but outside our shared world. And maybe outside, it doesn't help any. Is there a universe? Yeah, forget the outside. Is there a universe of stuff? Galaxies, electrons, quarks, maybe strings, who knows, utterly independent of us, so that even if Dasein ceased to exist, or even if Dasein had never existed, there'd still be these entities. So there'd be electrons, and they'd still have a weight, and they'd still have a spin, and they'd still have a charge, and which makes no reference to us whatsoever. That is what I'm going to call robust realism. I think Heidegger is a robust realist, and I'll try to convince you of that. I'll have maybe 50% success usually. But anyway, the interesting thing is that all that we've been saying so far inclines people who read Heidegger to think that he must be some kind of anti-realist. Namely, think that everything that shows up for us is somehow related to our practices for disclosing things and disclosing a world. Now I can't help I don't want to hide my view that is not what follows. But I first have to try to convince you that there are lots and lots of people. Bill Blattner, that you like and I like so much, and his book is so clear, thinks that Heidegger is, quote, a temporal idealist. Lots of people think that Heidegger is some kind of, well, it's better to say anti-realist. The idealist suggests that Heidegger would think that somehow there is nothing but the world of our experiences, and the universe is just another whole big bunch of experiences. Surely nobody thinks Heidegger's that kind of idealist. But you could think that Heidegger's an anti-realist of the sort who says we don't ever get access to things as they are in themselves, independent of us and our concerns, and therefore we can't ever say anything about the structure of the universe as it is in itself. Okay, now I'm going to stick to my notes, but you keep that in mind. I'll say one more thing before we look at the details. The interesting opposite view to Heidegger's is something which I'm calling deflationary realism. It's the view that, of course, all this stuff is independent of me and my mind, and so are chairs and baseballs and electrons. And they're all independent of us in the same sort of way. And we have this natural ontological commitment to the fact that when we deal with things, we always, I've got this quote here. Where is it? What Arthur Fine is a typical case, calls the natural ontological attitude. The natural ontological attitude, I made a mistake in my commentary of falling for it, thinking that Fine was some kind of robust realist. That he's not. He says that we're all realists. And what kind of realists? Well, we just all believe, quite naturally. He says we accept the evidence of our senses with regard to the existence of everyday objects and accept in the same way the results of science. Now, if you're a robust realist, you say, well, no, that's not quite, that can't be right. The baseballs and all this sort of human social stuff depends on us in a way that electrons don't, and there's an important distinction inside this attitude that everything, that there are these things independent of us. Let's see now. I want to find one other quote. So Heidegger says, for instance, it must be stated that the entities are in themselves. This is History of Concept of Time, 217. Independent of any apprehension we have of them. I'm reading it a little bit differently than it is here. Yet the being of the entity is found only in encounter and made understandable from the... No, I don't think I want to read that. And not that it goes against it, it just doesn't help. So let's not read that. I'm going to go back to my notes. I keep wanting to sort of blurt out the answer, but if I don't do it step by step, I'll lose you. Okay. So if Dasein and the meaning of all the objects that Dasein deals with depends on Dasein's disclosing a world, and the world is some kind of what Charles Taylor calls a co-production between Dasein and whatever it is that Dasein is thrown into, there's no place in there for an independent universe. If there was no world of disclosing practices, then we couldn't even make sense of the notion of independent objects or non-independent objects. There would just be a universe of things, and the universe of things would exist whether Dasein existed or not. What am I saying? Cancel, I think, what I just said. I'm confusing myself and you. I see, I said it as a question in my notes. That is, the world, and okay, no wonder I got confused. This world seems to be somehow a co-production of us and our skills and our openness and something or other that we're interacting with and are open to and can get a grip on and so forth. And now my question was, does that mean that if there were no world in disclosing practices, then we couldn't make sense of independent objects, so that the very notion of independent objects depends on us, and this sort of looks like the notion the universe disappears as in the present at hand becomes just one way of taking things. I'll make this clearer, I swear I will, but I'm not making it very clear yet. So if our background practice is what enables us to encounter things and to make them intelligible, then how can we make intelligible things absolutely independent of us and our encountering them? That's this thing again. Is there a universe? Are there things in themselves with properties that don't in any way relate to our capacity for disclosing a world and encountering entities? Let me just keep reading this and see if it helps any. You can read the belief system issue the other way. Suppose everything depends on our background practices, all our ways of revealing things and encountering things. And if that isn't a belief system, but it's our practices, then if it's a belief system, we can then separate our interpretation of the world, our understanding of the world, our understanding of the universe from whatever's out there that either confirms or doesn't. But if all we've got are these practices, which we can't get clear about, which are our forehaving, and we're always in the hermeneutic circle, that is, we've always got a whole way of relating to the world and to other people and stuff in our behavior, and we can't turn it into a belief system, and we can't get clear about it. Therefore, we can't sort of bracket it. So we can't know how much of the world that we think is out there and is independent of us and the universe is in any way the way we think it is, because we don't know how much we're contributing. This is the way it begins to look if you go a certain way with Heidegger. We must be somehow reading our background understanding, our interpretation into everything we discover and everything we disclose, So we can't discover anything as it really is. That we're getting more and more into some kind of non-robust realism, so anti-realism. There is no such thing, this is the crucial phrase, if you're getting lost, keep this in mind. Is there any such thing as pure discovering and the pure present at hand? It looks like, to the anti-realists reading Heidegger, and to anti-realists anyway, that there is no pure discovering and there is no pure present at hand. It's all within our practices, within our forehaving. And then that seems to lead to anti-realism. And now the question is, where's Heidegger in all this? Okay, so I used to think, and in my commentary, I think, and you should be wary if you read this chapter in the commentary, that Heidegger believes that there are things in themselves utterly independent of our practices, even though we don't know what our practices are. We can nonetheless get out of all of our practices and have pure discovery of the pure present at hand. I used to think that. I still think that's what he believes. But now I have to give you some guidelines that I learned the hard way. That's not what he believes in the chapter on reality that you've just been reading. That's what he believes back on page 408 when he does his story about science, which we'll come to next time. Remember, I told you read some funny page numbers that just in case you don't know what I'm talking about page 412, what he calls the existential conception of science, from 412 to 415. There, I think, he shows you how you can be a realist about science, and that science can give you pure discovery and tell you about the present at hand in the universe. However, the part we're reading, I think, is deflationary realism. I think this whole section on realism that we get here is telling you that there's something like this natural ontological attitude in which you take it that you are coping with things as they are in themselves, where that means independent of what you think they are, independent of whether you're handling them or not, independent of how they look to you. That Heidegger thinks that in a kind of minimum but very important sense, because we are this kind of openness on the world, we always disclose the world as things are, in some sense of in themselves. Now this looks puzzling, and I'm not sure this is right, but I tried very hard in writing the commentary to show that in the section on reality, Heidegger really meant by things in themselves the universe of entities that have no relation to us whatsoever. And I think that's just wrong. He thinks that this is a thing in itself, that things in themselves, the way Heidegger sort of defusing the term in itself, so that we are open to things as they are in themselves. If that's true, then you see what you get. Electrons and baseballs are the same ontologically. They are the kind of entities, independent of each of us and independent of each of our particular views about them. Here's a way to think about it, and I think it helps a lot. I'm going to put you through what happened between me and Searle about this about 10 years ago, or maybe 20 now. I think Searle wants to be a robust realist, and he fell into deflationary realism. And Heidegger, I think, is happy to be a deflationary realist about the everyday world, but he's a robust realist about the universe. Now, let me tell you what happened with Searle. So Searle has this interesting view that and you may have, how many of you, tell me if you heard him talk about this, that we represent things as being some way or other, but it depends on the things themselves, whether there are any such things. So we represent mountains, and then there may be mountains and there may not be mountains. And he's a realist because he thinks that the representation part is in our mind and up to us. But whether there are any things that satisfy any of our representations is up to the world. And that sounds good. And I think that's something like what Heidegger thinks wants to defend in this chapter. Only not in terms of inner and outer, the way Searle would put it, but in terms of we have a whole referential totality, and we have a way of turning things into present at hand, and all of that is something that we can do, and when we do, then things show up for us or they don't, and whether they do or they don't is not up to us, up to our representations. We can represent hammers, and then maybe there are some hammers and maybe there aren't any hammers. We can represent Santa Clauses. Turns out there aren't any, at least so I've been told. And therefore, so it looks like Searle's got a nice distinction in which that you can be a robust realist about everything insofar as you make this distinction between what we represent, like mountains, and whether there are any, independent of our representation, mountains or not. But when Searle told me this, my reaction, I wasn't trying to be difficult, was to say, yeah, but that's okay for mountains, but what about money? When you represent something as money, it's true that whether I have any dollar in my pocket or not doesn't depend on me, and there's this kind of realism. This is, again, this basic deflationary realism. I can ask whether there really is a dollar in my pocket, and there really is and there really isn't, and it's not up to me. But new complication is that what it is to be a dollar is up to me, and now that lets in a new problem about independent reality, because it now looks like all we've ever got is our understanding of what it is to be a hammer, and then we can find out whether there are any hammers. Our understanding of what it is to be an electron, and then we can find out whether there are any electrons. And our understanding of what it is to be a baseball, and we can find out whether there are any baseballs. But now you level the distinction between what is dependent on our definition of it, baseballs and money, and what is independent of our definition of it, electrons and galaxies. And if you're not careful, it's very difficult not to start to go into anti-realism, because it looks like, and now here's the way to put it, it looks like we just group things in the world according to our own interests. It isn't as if we have, we pick out something and call it a mountain. From the point of view of a great big Martian landing, they would be just molehills. And so it looks like everything that, there's a good phrase for this in a philosopher named Ian Hacking. I'm going to talk more about Hacking, so I'm going to write that on the board. He's a good philosopher of science, and he talks about functionally relevant groupings. That is, we group things into objects relative to our interests. The dramatic example, and I don't know if he's the first to use it, is constellations. Constellations have a very special thing. I mean, there are constellations, all right, and people have seen them for thousands and thousands of years, but there's nothing in the universe there. It's just a relevant grouping to us who like to see things in the sky. And maybe everything that we think is so we group them into galaxies, and we group them into electrons, and we group them into baseballs. All that's really there is something sort of malleable chaos. This is Nietzsche's view. How many recognize this from the Nietzsche course? That is, there's chaos, and then we, in terms of our interest, impose order on it. And now it looks like Searle's story doesn't get us out of that, because it says, we make these representations of mountains and baseballs and in games like chess. We define things as the queen, and then we can find out whether there are any. But all of that is relevant to us in our grouping. We don't find out what's true about the universe, and we've leveled baseballs and electrons. That's the question. And I think Searle realized and wrote a great book about the nature of social reality, of money, But the moral is that that argument between what we represent and whether there's anything out there like that doesn't get you robust realism, because what we represent may all be relevant to our practices, relative to our interests, and finding out whether there's anything like that there's only anything like that insofar as there's anything like a constellation. It doesn't prove that it's there independent. So now, what happens is then, interestingly enough, what happens with Searle, as far as I could see, is he just decides he's going to be a robust realist by saying nobody in their right mind nowadays, given the modern world and science, could be anything but a robust realist. That really are electrons, period. But the argument is gone. If all you do is think you can make it by distinguishing your representation and what's really there, because your representation may be carving up what's really there. So where am I now? So Searle's telling you that I'm just skimming this. So Searle just says they're brute facts, period, and they're studied by science, period. What I think is you need an argument for something like that, and he hasn't got it. And I don't know whether Heidegger's got it, but I'm going to try to show you that Heidegger at least thinks he's got it, or at least thinks that he ought to have it. That is, the question is whether you can make a distinction between the way of being of stuff in the universe, like electrons, let me repeat, whose structure and existence is totally independent of us and what interests us, and it's just electrons are just the way they are and so forth. Can you distinguish that? And then you would have pure discovering when you talked about electrons, and they would be pure present at hand. Or is everything relative to us grouping things like hammers in the referential totality, relative to our purposes and our stand on our being and so forth? And okay, I'm going to start next time with trying to show first, just very quickly, how the chapter on realism is deflationary realism, because nowhere in there does he talk about the universe as independent of our knowing it. He wants to say everything is independent of our coping and our knowing it. And then I want to show how when he gets to that chapter about the existential nature of science and theory, he comes up with what's still supposed to be an argument for independent universe. I see one hand up. I think we have 2 minutes.
How does that make sure that don't fall into thinking of our
Well, you're right. I think what you're saying is something I was sort of skirting around and almost saying. That the inner in your mind corresponding to the external world is dumped. That goes with epistemology. But there's something about can we make a distinction between what shows up in the world for us and what is, so to speak, out there in the universe. That distinction is okay. I mean, at least it hasn't, nothing wrong. We're not saying, we have access to our private experiences. How do we ever know there are any chairs and people? We say we've got a world. We understand how the world is all carved up and experienced relative to our referential whole and our stands that we take on ourselves. Is there also, so to speak, outside of that world or beyond that world or external to that world, a universe of stuff that is totally independent of us and our interests? That's okay. That doesn't fall into the epistemological mess. Okay, I have to stop. Time's up.